Our first speaker, Simon Schama, is University Professor of Art History and History at Columbia University. In addition to his distinguished teaching career, he has lectured extensively on topics ranging from the epic tradition in English history to really old masters, late style from Titian to de Kooning, the latter as the series of Andrew Mellon lectures on the visual arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. He is the author of numerous works, including The Embarrassment of Riches, an interpretation of Dutch culture in the Golden Age, Landscape and Memory, The History of Britain trilogy, which was the basis for his award-winning Emmy-nominated series of the same name, and most recently, The Power of Art, a publication that accompanied his BBC series, in which, I might add, Turner had a featured role. His lecture today, Turner and the Romance of Britain, brings him back to familiar territory, as he's just returned from St. Paul, where he was covering the Republican National Convention for the BBC. And I'll leave it at that. Please welcome Professor Schama.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's wonderful to be here. In the interests of the historical record, actually, I manage Denver, but not St. Paul. There's not a secret partisanship to be detected, and that we just ran out of time and money, as the BBC often does. One of Turner's most savage and unsparing critics was a man called Michelangelo Tit Marsh. This, as yes, you'll all have guessed, was actually a nom de plume. It was a nom de plume for the novelist and journalist William Makepeace Thackeray, who could actually get very seriously on Turner's case when he chose to. He chose to, for example, in the famous or notorious case of slavers, the slave ship in Boston, known as slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying Typhon coming on. But Michelangelo Tit Marsh, a.k.a. William Makepeace Thackeray, in the case of this painting, The Fighting Temeraire Tugged to Its Last Berth, had nothing really but praise. He called this painting a magnificent national ode. And using that phrase, he managed to characterize pretty much the general public response to the painting that Turner himself acknowledged to be his favorite, at least to the extent of calling it affectionately my old darling. It was also the painting when British public was asked by BBC Radio to vote on its single most favorite painting in collections and in Britain, actually voted for this painting, rather surprisingly over hot contenders by John Constable. So it was seen right away as a painting that was very important for its content, for what it actually had to say about Britain, and the sense of British history, the relationship between past, present, and future. It was shown in 1838, it was first exhibited in 1838, and that itself was a not insignificant moment in the passage of British time. It was a year after the accession of the new Queen, young Queen Victoria. And it was a moment when the problematic relationship between the British past and what might be the aggressive industrial future of the country was much contemplated by Britain's most urgently meditative writers. Thomas Carlyle, for example, was doing the first draft of his disquisition on exactly that theme, called Past and Present. It wouldn't be published in 1843. But Thomas Carlyle was among a number of those who were brooding about what might be lost in the British past as a result of the trade-off of Christian sentiment for industrial gain. Another much more aggressive figure in this line of thought and reflection about what constituted national community was Augustus Northmore Welby Pugin, the architect and architectural designer, who in 1836, just a couple of years before The Fighting Temeraire was shown, produced a book called Contrast, which I don't have an image for you, alas, but it's an extraordinary book, and all it tried to do was actually produce images of Pugin's slightly sentimental version of the late Christian Middle Ages, abbeys and almshouses and cathedrals and such like, with their delicate Gothic perpendicular style, and contrast them unfavorably with the harsh utilitarianism of the present age, and that sense in which somehow what Carlyle called the demonic age of the machine had come to pass at the expense of what were taken to be the sacred values of a now perished Christian England was much in the air at this particular moment. I guess the question that facing all those who thought about the fate of Britain at a crossroads, and moments of thinking about national community at a particular crossroads happen to nations, don't they? What was on everybody's mind was that actually, are we at a Faustian moment? Are the temptations of filthy lucre, Britain's imperial brilliance as an empire of industry, too much if we're actually going to lose our shared sense of Christian soul? Is it possible, in fact, to perpetuate the values of Christian community in this hard utilitarian, Gregorian society of industrial capitalism? Now, what has all that really got to do with the Fighting Temeraire? Well, you'll know, of course, actually, that many of you, I'm sure, will, that the two senses of a Britain gone and a Britain arrived are there in the central, I do, there we are. There, in fact, and a lot of the critics pounced on this, actually. Those who were less keen than Michelangelo Tit Marsh, William Makepeace Thackeray, thought, in fact, that generally characterized the tugboat there as a kind of sooty little monster, in the words of one critic. Others dragging along the ghostly hulk of the Fighting Temeraire. So there was a sense in which actually this is a pessimistic painting. Not everybody took that view. Those who did also pointed to the sunset. It was very quickly pointed out, both at the time and forever since, that Turner, as usual, had taken liberties both with time and place, because actually the story of the ship is that the ship was one of those ships that had fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. And we'll see in a minute, Turner has a very direct relationship between the Battle of Trafalgar and a more general sense of where British history was going. Battle of Trafalgar, the great battle in which Nelson prevailed over the French fleet, sparing Britain from invasion. Battle of Trafalgar had happened, of course, in 1805, so 33 years before this painting was done. The Temeraire was then a symbol, certainly not of old Christian Britain, but of an older, heroic Britain. It had served its time. It was now redundant, of course, as a great image from the age of sail. It had served its time, first of all, as a prison hulk, and then as a kind of a depot for stores. But finally, there was no more use for it, so it's being tugged upriver. The direction in which the little convoy is sailing means actually that if indeed this is a sunset, the sunset is actually happening in the east, not the west. So someone said, well, actually, it can be incredibly bright and optimistic painting because guess what? It's a sunrise, not a sunset after all. Turner generally didn't care about such things. Those were issues of Gradgrindian literalism for which he had contempt. He didn't really mind. He wanted this great bellying depth of sunlight happening just where it happened in the image. Other liberties that were taken with this, so it wasn't simply just a documentary narrative, was that it was, we know from those who actually saw it happen, that, and indeed it would be the case, that when you were going to break up an enormous man of war like that, its masts would have been dismantled a long time ago.